So it's FAQ time again, and there have been a few important changes to Imperial Fists and Salamanders. So let's take a look. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel where we're looking to get the best out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we're just going to take a quick look at the rules changes that have been made by Games Workshop in the FAQs for Salamanders and Imperial Fists, and how they might impact things on the battlefield. So we'll start with Salamanders, and they have two major changes here, and a bit of designer's commentary. The designer's commentary essentially says that they basically made a big error with the self-sacrifice stratagem, which I completely agree with them, and that it was being used in ways that clearly weren't ever intended by the design team. I agree 100% that the way that it worked clearly wasn't intended by the design team, as it could basically make a large amount of your Salamanders or other Imperial army untargetable if you used the self-sacrifice stratagem on a character. Essentially, the character couldn't be targeted because it wasn't the closest model to the enemy army, and the self-sacrifice stratagem meant that any Imperial infantry units that are within 6 inches of that character couldn't be targeted unless they were the closest models too. If you combine this effect with something tough that was nearer to the enemy, say a few rhinos or a couple of impulsors with shield domes, it basically meant that almost your entire army could be untargetable until you chewed through those exceptionally tough units. And to my mind, this just completely feels wrong, because I think that the image that they're trying to go for is a Salamander's unit tanking bullets for an allied unit, and not a character hiding in the midst of those allied units, somehow making them untargetable. I also think it's just fairly daft, being clearly able to see an entire enemy army, but only being able to shoot the first few units out of it, so it was pretty broken. I don't use the word broken to describe many things, but this is clearly a game mechanic that wasn't doing anything near what it was intended to do, and could sort of take the shooting phase out of the game. So on the whole, I'm glad that they've addressed it, but I'm not 100% convinced that the way they've addressed it was the best. So they've changed the wording on the stratagem, and this is the way it is now worded. You use it at the start of your opponent's shooting phase. You select one Salamander's infantry unit that contains 5 or more models from your army. That's important because it means that you now can't use it on characters. And it can't be within 1 inches of enemy units, which is also important because it means that you can't use it on a unit that's untargetable because of being in close combat. Now you can select only one other infantry unit from your army, and that's another restriction. It's gone down from all infantry units within 6 inches to just one infantry unit, and that infantry unit has to be wholly within 6 inches of the first unit you selected. So that means that they really have to be very close. And until the end of the phase, your opponent cannot target the second unit you selected unless that unit is the closest enemy unit to the firing model and visible to it, or is no longer wholly within 6 inches of the first unit. So that means that you could kill a bunch of models out of the first unit, and if the second unit is then out of range, the stratagem will stop working. In addition, the first unit you selected, so the one that's tanking, can always be selected as a viable target against shooting attacks from an enemy unit that's visible and in range of it. This is to get around things like the shrouding psychic power, as they say in the stratagem, from stopping you from shooting the unit that is tanking by another means. So that's a whole host of restrictions and qualifications that they have put on that rule. But in my opinion, they still haven't quite got it right. The main thing that they haven't addressed is that the first unit still doesn't have to be visible to the firing models for this whole thing to take effect. So say you could have 5 Salamanders Tactical Marines chilling out in the bottom floor of a ruin out of line of sight, and have, say, a Centurion Devastator squad standing just outside the ruin, slightly set back from the unit. That means that you can now neither target the tactical squad that's in the ruin because it's out of line of sight, and you can't target the Centurion Devastator squad because it's not closer than the tactical squad, or indeed any other unit in your army that might be further up the field. I'm afraid that this is still pretty broken, though obviously nowhere near as stupidly strong as it was before. If the image that they're going for is to have the first squad taking bullets for the squad behind it, then the stratagem should only really ever come into effect if, when you're firing, you can see both units. This would force the self-sacrificing player to put their tanking unit out in the open next to the squad that they're supposed to be protecting, which I think would actually fulfill the visual imagery, rather than again creating an absurd situation in which neither of one of the units can be shot, unless you have ignores line of sight weaponry. So in my opinion, they've almost fixed this, but sort of fallen at the final hurdle. I'm a little bit disappointed by this because it's unlikely we're going to get any more FAQs or errata to change this, at least in the near future. And it seems like if they were going to change it, they really should have thought it through all the way. But never mind, I guess it does still cost 2 CP to have that effect. You can counter it with Ignores line of sight weaponry, and you can still use it as the designers intended, and it's probably more flexible to do so. Say if you had a 10-man intercessor squad trying to tank bullets for that same Centurion Devastator squad. You can certainly make just as good, if not better, use of it by having a big tough unit out in front of the second unit behind it, and it means that you're nowhere near as restricted with positioning. It's still an insanely strong stratagem, because by forcing your enemy to chew through a massive amount of tough infantry to get to some of your high damage output dealing units, you really give those damage output units the maximum chance to achieve their purpose. As I said, it would be particularly good on a big unit of Centurions, who have insane damage output but not quite as good survivability. Maybe a big unit of Devastators, or Hellblasters, or perhaps even Boltstorm Aggressors in certain circumstances. Still a very strong stratagem, I just wish that they thought through the implications of line of sight when dealing with it. Okay, so we've talked quite a bit about that one, let's move on. They also decided to change the stratagem The Fires of Battle in this update as well, and this is the Salamanders stratagem that costs 1 command point and it targets a single model armed with flamer weapons. Basically the way that this worked is for every wound roll of a 4+ that model made when attacking an enemy unit, the target would suffer a mortal wound in addition to its normal damage. Now on an average model with a flamer, this really isn't all that powerful. It's certainly not bad, it'll give you an average of 1.75 mortal wounds, so it could be handy in a pinch. The thing is, they probably didn't take into account all of the most powerful flamer weapons that you can have to offer in a Salamander's army list, and they didn't consider how this would stack with the Flamecraft stratagem, which lets you automatically get the maximum number of shots from flamer weapons. Now Flamecraft costs 2 command points, so it might be a bit underwhelming to spend 3 whole command points to get your average 3 mortal wounds from the single flamer, but you could apply it to the Invicta Tactical Warsuits, so that would give you 12 shots with the Incendium Cannon and also an average of 6 mortal wounds. Or really silly, if you manage to get a single Flamestorm Aggressor into double firing range, which you could potentially do with another stratagem, then you will get 24 hits with the Flamecraft stratagem, and if you used Fires of Battle on top of that, that would be an average of a mad 12 mortal wounds, in addition to all the damage that 24 flamer hits would do anyway. While this is absolutely hilarious, and it is a bit limited because of how short-range flamer weapons are, I think it is a little bit silly to have the toughest models around, say like Leviathan Dreadnoughts, melted by a single round of shooting by anti-infantry weapons from one model. So they have chosen to change it, and they've capped it at a maximum of 3 mortal wounds inflicted per phase via this stratagem. So that means it's still pretty nice on things like Invicta Tactical Warsuits, which you'll certainly be wanting as Salamanders for those Incendium Cannons, where with an average roll of 7 you'll typically get the full 3 mortal wounds. For 1 command point, that's really not too bad, so I think that it was probably a sensible change for game balance purposes. There are a few other small bits in the Salamanders Codex that aren't quite as big deals. I think they've changed the wording on Stand Your Ground, but as far as I can tell it still functions the same. They've clarified a few fancy Forge World weapons are flame weapons, including the Infernus Cannon, Dreadnought Inferno Cannon, and Burning Wrath. And they've FAQ'd a couple of things. First of all, the Born Protectors stratagem. They've just clarified that you can still use that in Overwatch, even if the defending unit was unable to do so. I believe that this was the way it was supposed to work before, so not really much of a change. And they've clarified the damage characteristic of the Strength of the Primarch stratagem when combined with the fancy Thunderhammer Drake Smiter. Drake Smiter does 6 damage on the roll of a 6, and Strength of the Primarch will increase that to 9 on the roll of a 6, rather than 12 as some people were arguing. So on the whole, the Salamanders have copped a couple of nerfs, but it was only to the extremely bonkers out there scenarios, which don't let you target half their army, or have the potential to do up to 24 mortal wounds from one cheap model. So overall, I think that the changes are pretty fair, and they don't really affect the way that most people will be playing Salamanders in my opinion. Let's move on to Imperial Fists now, and this one's a bit of a shorter FAQ, mainly centering around the Vigilus Defiance Siegebreaker Cohort detachment. There is one bit from the main codex though. They have errated the Shield Unwavering, which is the stratagem where you add 1 to saving throws for your enemy's turn when you're within 3 inches of an objective, and they've clarified that the stratagem does not affect invulnerable saves. On the whole, I think that this is probably a good thing, as Games Workshop have been trying to lock down the amount of times that you can get 2-up invul saves in the game, and this was a very, very easy way to get 2-up invul saves on models with storm shields. So it's a minor nerf, but I still think that the best application of this stratagem was probably to stack it on some Centurions in cover and make them nigh unkillable, and that doesn't really have any effect on that. Next up are the changes to the Vigilus Defiance Siegebreaker cohort. Firstly, they've clarified that the Eye of Hypnoth and the Indomitable Warlord trait from the Specialist detachments no longer take effect, as they've been rolled into the main book. The Eye of Hypnoth functions largely the same and is an absolutely great relic with reroll 1s to wound in the shooting phase, so it's almost like having a lieutenant in your back pocket. And the Indomitable Warlord trait has been changed quite a bit in its new version in the Codex, so that means that the Siegebreaker cohort is really only good for its stratagem. Seismic Devastation, the stratagem that I talked about in the Siegebreaker cohort video, has received a small but sensible nerf. The stratagem costs 1 command point, and previously for every 6-up that you rolled to wound when you're using a Siegebreaker cohort unit against a vehicle or building, you would get a mortal wound on the target. Now this has quickly become silly strong with the new Imperial Fists Codex, as you could combine it with a Chaplain Listening to give them +1 to wound, and the Imperial Fists Tank Hunters stratagem to give it another +1 to wound. That meant that when you were firing some bolter shots off with your Centurions, every wound roll of a 4+ would give you a mortal wound on the vehicle. So this means that basically each Centurion would have a pretty decent chance of completely demolishing a vehicle all by themselves. So the errata is that they've changed the stratagem to only affect unmodified rolls of 6s. Interestingly enough, I don't really think that this is all that much of a nerf. If you are going gung-ho and taking the entire big unit of 6 Centurions with heavy bolters and hurricane bolters, if you point it at a vehicle that's in range, have some Chapter Master rerolls nearby, and the Eye of Hypnoth for reroll 1s to wound, you still get an average of 18 or 19 mortal wounds on that target, and you get that on top of all of your normal damage, and again on average you'll be getting something like 12 damage to heavy bolter wounds on the target as well. In reality that kind of means that whatever vehicle that you pointed at is still almost certainly dead, and that's not accounting for using the Chaplain Listening buff or the Tank Hunter stratagem or the Bolter Drill stratagem. So this is a small nerf, but honestly it doesn't really make all that much difference. It's still a stratagem that when you use it on the biggest unit that you can use it on, can get you about 19 mortal wounds. There aren't really many stratagems in the game that cost 1 command point and give you that sort of damage output, so it's still ridiculously strong. Even if you only get a fraction of that amount, it's still definitely going to be worth it. Finally, they've just clarified whether or not an Imperial Fist successor chapter could use the Imperial Fist Siegebreaker cohort, and they've said that no, it is only limited to Imperial Fist itself. So unfortunately Crimson Fists aren't going to be able to access this. I'm not sure it would have been the biggest deal in the world to let them. But in the name of the detachment itself, it is called an Imperial Fists Siegebreaker cohort, and the Crimson Fists do have their own specialist detachment, so I'm not sure it's the biggest deal. So overall, no major changes from the Imperial Fists FAQ. Seismic Devastation is no longer as hilariously ludicrous, but it's still got every chance of killing basically any vehicle that you point it at, so not too bad in my opinion. Please let me know your thoughts on the FAQs down in the comments below. I know it always gets a mixed reaction when Games Workshop makes rules adjustments within a short period of releasing a codex, but personally I'm of the opinion that I'd rather have the interesting and varied rules, and for them to make some tweaks to some errors afterwards, rather than making the rules boring and not try anything interesting with game mechanics. That is my personal opinion though, and obviously it's best if they can try and get the rules done right the first time. Thanks for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to hear more like this. We'll be continuing our reviews of the Masters of the Chapter from Faith and Fury this week, and there may just be a Forge World Space Marine review sometime later today, so feel free to stick around if you'd like to hear that. Thanks for listening, I'll see you guys next time.